Welcome back to the Mildew Twang Outdoors podcast, where we chronicle our time spent in the Delta, the swamps, the piney woods, and beyond. Here, we share our experiences and stories ranging from simple country living to lesser-known stories of American culture and what all of this means for us as Christians in today's world. Last week, we looked at Jim Bridger's first foray into the western frontier as a member of William Ashley and Andrew Henry's 100 Enterprising Young Men. In summary, Ashley and Henry assembled a group of young men who would be willing to head up the Missouri to face the unknown wilds of the frontier in search of fame and fortune. Unlike the fortunes to come in 1849, the California Gold Rush, the reward for participating in the newly formed trapping companies would be riches built upon the woolly, dingy brown pelt of the aquatic rodent, the Castor canadensis, or put simply, the beaver. The first year of Bridger's western voyage was marked by death, trials, and tribulations at the hands of the Blackfeet and Arikara tribes, as well as a long-running scandal involving the mauling of Hugh Glass at the hands of Ursus arctos horribilis, a great white bear, or, as we know today, the grizzly bear. Whether you have made your mind up on the dilemma regarding the identity of the youth who abandoned Hugh Glass, we will continue to follow Jim Bridger through the years. Away from friends, away from home, and all the heart holds dear, a weary wanderer laid him down, nor kindly aid was near. And sickness preyed upon his frame and told its tale of woe, while sorrow marked his pallid cheeks and sank his spirit low. Nor waiting friends stood round his couch, a healing to impart, nor human voice spoke sympathy to soothe his aching heart. The stars of night his watchers were, his fan the rude wind's breath, and while they sighed their hollow moans, he closed his eyes in death. Upon the prairie's vast expanse this weary wanderer lay, and far from friends and far from home, he breathed his life away. A lovely valley marks the spot that claims his lowly bed, but o'er the wanderer's hapless fate no friendly tear was shed. No willing grave received the corpse of this poor lonely one. His bones, alas, were left to bleach and moulder 'neath the sun. The night wolf howled his requiem, the rude winds danced his dirge, and ere anon, in mournful chime, sighed forth the mellow surge. The spring shall teach the rising grass to twine for him a tomb, and o'er the spot where he doth lie shall bid the wildflowers bloom. But far from friends and far from home, ah, dismal thought, to die! Oh, let me, mid my friends expire, and with my fathers lie. This poem, titled A Wanderer's Grave, was written by Rufus Sage. After the death of a man named Hiram Scott in 1830, these words were penned. Now such dark words lend themselves to the contemplation on the morbid truths of life and death. They help put the life of the frontiersman into perspective, as today we see the great heroes of old as invincible. What we must remember is that they were human just like you and me, and the mortal dangers and trials faced by these western trappers, guides, and frontiersmen had the same effect on them as it would on us today. As we journey through time, please keep this in mind. It may influence your perception of our history and our culture, even into the modern age. So far, we have covered Jim Bridger's introduction to the world of the frontier trapper and his connection to the greatest mountain man legend of all time, Hugh Glass. There is, however, far more to Bridger's life. As a trapper, Bridger would work for the Ashley and Henry Fur Company, which went on to become the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. He would be a key player in orchestrating and attending the Mountain Man Rendezvous events, which were held between 1825 and 1840. During his life, Bridger would marry women from the Flathead, the Ute, and the Shoshone tribes. These marriages served as personal gain for both Bridger and his spouse, but they also helped to further Native American and American relationships. Though he never could read and write, Bridger would learn to effectively communicate with the tribes using Indian hand signing, which would be used extensively through his life as a trapper, guide, frontiersman, and a scout. He would also learn to speak, at least in some part, Spanish, French, and native languages including Bannock, Crow, Shoshone, Salish, Nez Perce, Pend d'Oreille, and Ute. Bridger would discover both the Great Salt Lake and explore the Yellowstone region extensively, building an intensive mental map of the western United States. This internal map would not only serve as the basis for guiding others, but Bridger would work alongside many men to develop topographical maps and new stagecoach travel routes throughout the West. The Mountain Man Rendezvous was a function of the old-time Mountain Man and the distributors, the commercial distributors in St. Louis, and it played a key role in beginning the development of the Western frontier. Let's hear a little bit about the rendezvous themselves and how Bridger influenced these events. The Mountain Man Rendezvous began in 1825 and was organized by fur trading companies and tradesmen. The 1825 rendezvous took place in present-day McKinnon, Wyoming, and was the first gathering of white traders and trappers in the Rocky Mountains. William Ashley initiated this rendezvous by gathering 25 men and 50 pack horses, leaving St. Louis in October of 1824 to travel overland to the high plains. Ashley and the men reached the Green River in April 1825 and sent out groups of trappers, both to work and to inform the additional trappers still in the field that there would be a gathering in that summer to trade and buy goods. By July of 1825, more than 120 trappers had assembled at Henry's Fork. Beaver pelts would be traded for coffee and sugar, both $1.50 a pound, knives, $2.50 each, flints, $1 a dozen, gunpowder, $1.50 a pound, and lead, $1 a pound. These pelts were exchanged at a value of $3 a pound for a dried pelt. Bear in mind that $1 in 1825 was equivalent to $31.15 today. That's a steep price to pay for common items, but the men were eager for a taste of home, and they were thrilled to have the opportunity to replenish their dwindling stocks. The 1825 rendezvous transformed the mountain man way of life. Trappers now had relative assurance that they could trade furs with the U.S. states efficiently without having to travel halfway across the country themselves. These trappers also knew that they would be able to resupply more effectively. More important than the trade goods themselves, the rendezvous allowed the mountain men to keep up with the news of the day, both stateside and within the mountains with each other. During this rendezvous, Jedediah Smith became Ashley's partner in the trade, as Andrew Henry had left the fur trade in 1824 after disasters confronted him, including the loss of 2 keelboats and an attack by the Arikara killing 14 and wounding 10 men. It was after the 1825 rendezvous that Bridger found his way headed north to the Yellowstone River with Ashley and several dozen men. They were heading to meet General Henry Atkinson's boats to deliver their furs back to the settlements. Ashley took along 20 men to recover additional fur packages that had previously been stashed along the Sweetwater River, but the men were attacked by the Blackfeet, who stole 53 horses. The men, being stuck, reached out to another party member named Smith, who supplied additional horses, but the men were again attacked by the Crow. In a bizarre turn of events, the Crow made peace with the trappers the following day and returned the horses that they had previously stolen. The men traveled until they were stopped by an immense, narrow, deep canyon called Bad Pass. Ashley's intentions were to float his furs down the Bighorn River to the bottom of the canyon, but they were unsure if it was even possible. Bridger volunteered to run the river and report back to the men if he made it out alive. Lashing together a wooden raft, Bridger pushed out to face the whirlpools, rapids, and boiling eddies on the river, smashing against boulders and rocks hidden within the confines of the swirling waters. Having survived the ordeal, Bridger reported back to Ashley and Company that the river was far too rough to run the furs down in bullboats or hand-cut rafts, once again proving his prowess, his bravery, and his willingness to lead the men around him by example. The trappers and frontiersmen primarily used bullboats, horses, and hand-cut rafts for local travel. I just mentioned that Bridger used a hand-cut, hand-hewn raft to brave Bad Pass, but I also mentioned bullboats. Now, what in the world is a bullboat, and how did this play into the lives of these trappers? The vast expanses of wilderness were covered either by land or by water through various means. If possible, the use of waterways was preferred, and the mountain men quickly adopted native techniques to build small vessels in order to navigate various waterways. The most straightforward creation was a hand-cut raft made out of hewn logs and branches, lashed together with leather or rawhide. These heavy creations could be used to float rivers, carry pelts and supplies, and escape danger. Over time, however, the men began to prefer bullboats constructed of buffalo hides and tree branches. the hide would be stretched over a frame of cottonwood or box elder branches bent into a hoop formation and lashed together. The boats would typically be constructed with the hair of the buffalo facing inward, and as the hide would dry, it would constrict and tighten on the frame, forming a lightweight, shallow draft vessel used for exploration and daily tasks. Originally constructed by the American Indians, bull boats were used to haul wood, transfer meat, and most interestingly, as they were shallow draft, lightweight vessels, they would be used to drift quietly into enemy camps to steal horses and equipment. It's no wonder that the frontiersmen quickly adapted to its use. It's time to jump back into our story. In 1830, Bridger helped pilot a group of trappers to the rendezvous, which would be held at the junction of the Wind and the Popo-Egi rivers. I apologize for that pronunciation if that's wrong. He was partially responsible for getting the men to the gathering as well as their pelts and supplies in order to satiate the trappers' desire for liquor, sugar, coffee, and supplies. It was at this rendezvous that Bridger was asked to partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Along with Bridger, the co-owners included Tom Fitzpatrick, Milton Sublette, Henry Fraib, and Jean-Baptiste Gervais. Bridger would later earn the nickname Old Gabe. He would leave the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in 1834 due to financial and business complications. As a testament to the strength and determination of the frontiersmen, 1832 would bring about an incident in which Jim Bridger faced life or death and nearly lost. That year was particularly bloody for the newly formed Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and a brush with the Blackfeet tribe resulted in many wounded or killed on both sides of the fight. A Blackfeet leader of the Bloods named Eagle Ribs confronted Bridger and his men. Now, Eagle Ribs was a highly skilled fighter, and he claimed to have killed 8 trappers single-handedly, proudly displaying their scalps. Eagle Ribs eased forward with a small group of his own men bearing a peace pipe, which gave the appearance that he was ready to end the fighting. Bridger, sensing something wrong, cocked his rifle, but before he could fire a shot, Eagle Ribs grabbed the barrel and wrestled the gun downward, causing Bridger to fire an errant shot. 2 additional Blackfeet fired arrows at Bridger, driving one deep into his lower back and the second penetrating the flesh a bit higher. These arrows were razor-sharp, steel-tipped thanks to the Blackfeet's trading with the British for goods and weapons. While the upper arrow was successfully removed, the lower arrow was unable to be taken out. That arrowhead lived inside Bridger for nearly 3 years until a doctor showed up at the 1835 rendezvous. This doctor, named Marcus Whitman, was a Presbyterian missionary. He operated on Bridger and removed the arrowhead, which had embedded itself in a rib. The removal operation required, quote, the strength of 2 men to pry the arrowhead loose, and Bridger had to be held down during the operation. But such is the way of life on the frontier. The building of Fort Bridger marked a turning point for Jim Bridger and his fellow mountain men. In fact, a partnership with Louis Vasquez took place, and this particular fort would play a role in everything from the gold rush to the Oregon Trail and beyond. It was in the early 1840s that Bridger was determined to construct a home base, and he partnered with Louis Vasquez to build a fort overlooking Black's Fork on the Green River, west of the Continental Divide in the Mexico Territory. Bridger was certain that the western immigration of Americans was now heavy enough to support a permanent trading post, and he would initiate this venture. This land was Shoshone territory, and it was in an ideal location for trade both north and south, as well as east and west. Fort Bridger, unbeknownst to the 2 partners during its construction, would turn out to be a primary destination for American immigrants traveling to the Oregon territories and to California. Thousands upon thousands of travelers and explorers would see the beauty of Fort Bridger on their way to their final destinations. The Oregon Trail was a heavily used route stretching from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. As this fort was in an ideal location, Bridger's Fort became a primary trade route stop and rest area for many wagon trains headed out west. His fort consisted of stores of trade goods and a fully furnished blacksmith shop, which allowed for necessary repairs to wagons and traveling equipment. Bridger loved the company, and he thoroughly enjoyed sharing his overwhelming knowledge of travel and trade routes through the mountains. He would see thousands upon thousands of travelers, including those in the fabled Donner Reed party, who ultimately became trapped in the mountains and had to resort to cannibalism for survival. Jim Bridger also became well acquainted with Brigham Young and his band of religious followers who would become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Young and his band of followers were traveling west to escape religious persecution as they held beliefs that were contradictory to traditional Christian teachings. By traveling westward, Young happened across Jim Bridger and they set off on the wrong foot. It's rumored that Bridger shared his knowledge of travel and trade, and he had concerns about the future stability of a large group of settlers making their home in the high desert. Bridger expressed his concern with the group's intent to profit from grain and corn production, and Brigham Young took offense to this suggestion, and they became enemies pretty quickly. Bridger and Young would go on to face each other both socially and politically after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which saw the end of the Mexican-American War. Mexico ceded territory, which included present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California, Nevada, and Utah, and in doing so, the Mormons living around the Great Salt Lake in prior Mexican territory, and now Bridger, living just west of the Continental Divide, would now be a part of the United States. The Mormons were intent on unifying their rising nation and joining forces with the natives to fight against the U.S. government, which only further complicated matters for Bridger and his fellow mountain men who were caught in the middle, being both U.S. citizens and on friendly terms with many of the western tribes. There will be more to come on the Bridger-Young scandal shortly, but for now, the gold rush is near. In addition to serving as a western Rocky Mountain focal point for the Oregon Trail, the discovery of gold outside of Sutter's Fort in 1848 brought about a secondary influx of American immigrants as they flocked to California to seek fortune and fame. By the time the California gold rush was in full swing in 1849, beaver pelts were essentially worthless, as were wolf pelts, and the once thriving population of buffalo around the western Rocky Mountains had dwindled to practically nothing. Bridger and Vasquez relied heavily on immigrant trade from the Oregon Trail and the Gold Rush 49ers to continue to make a living, though even the land around Fort Bridger, once lush and picturesque, would become barren with a sheer number of travelers and livestock grazing on the land surrounding the fort. To put a number on the volume of Western fortune seekers, 1847 saw fewer than 5,000 travelers, while 1849 saw well more than 25,000 people. The once untainted wild lands of the American Indian and the early mountain man were now beginning to disappear in less than one generation of mankind. The mountain men trappers were frowned upon by many travelers, and their native wives and mixed children were the scorn of many, quote, Christian Americans. The immigrants traveling west never would understand the mountain men or their love for all things wild, nor would they understand their relationships with the native tribes. With the downfall of trapping and the influx of New America, the few remaining mountain men, including Bridger, were sought out by the U.S. government to aid in surveying, mapping, and science-seeking expeditions. In 1850, Bridger led Captain Stansbury and his men down Black's Fork, through the Green River Valley, and ultimately to a narrow flat shelf of land which would be named Bridger Pass. The knowledge of the mountain man was still useful to the government, and this newly recorded pass, which, by the way, had been in use by the trappers and the natives for years and years, shaved 61 miles off of the prior South Pass route. Bridger Pass would be the key location for an overland stagecoach road, the Transcontinental Railroad, and ultimately Interstate 80 through Wyoming. Negotiations with the native tribes would begin pretty quickly once American expansion started to head out west, and the first major treaty was called the Treaty at Horse Creek. Jim Bridger would play a key role in the formation of this treaty, but some of the circumstances surrounding the U.S. government in the honoring of this treaty are interesting. With his knowledge of native tribes and their respective homelands, Bridger would rekindle his friendship with Thomas Fitzpatrick, once co-owner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, now an Indian agent. Fitzpatrick would talk with Bridger and ask him to work alongside Colonel David D. Mitchell, Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Their goal was to develop a treaty between native tribes including the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Sioux, Assiniboine, Mandan, Gros Ventre, Arikara, and more. This treaty, known as the Horse Creek Treaty, was to include the following articles between the tribes and the U.S. government. Article 1. Establish peace between tribes. Article 2. Grant permissions for the construction of U.S. military forts within native territories. Article 3. Provide protection to the nations regarding depredation and damages by the U.S. people. Article 4. Provide restitution from the Indian nations for any wrongdoings committed on the people of the U.S. Article 5. Provide specific territories to each respective tribe, which should be honored by the tribes. Article 6. Assign representatives from the Indian nations through whom all business will be conducted and bind themselves to sustain said chiefs and their successors during good behavior. Article 7. The U.S. shall, due to damages which have occurred or may occur, pay the Indian nations the sum of $50,000 a year for 10 years. Article 8. Stipulations for upholding the agreements in the previous articles. One of the more troubling aspects of the treaty was the intent of the U.S. government to hold each tribe responsible for attacks on settlers that took place within their respective territories. The federal government did not keep its promise to protect Indian resources and tribal hunting groups from depredation by settlers who were moving westward. The U.S. government also made only one payment rather than the signed 10, which had already been whittled down from 50. While this did not start the wars with the native tribes, it sure did nothing to foster a continued friendship. I must believe that Jim Bridger and his fellow mountain man would have been disgusted by the treatment of the native tribes, particularly as they had been involved in aiding in the development and implementation of the initial treaty. It's time for another special appearance by Brigham Young. To further complicate the ever-changing life in the West, a series of legal disputes, most of which were artificially fabricated, arose between Brigham Young and his followers and were directed at Jim Bridger and the remaining mountain men. Now that Fort Bridger was a part of the Utah Territory, Young saw Bridger as a greater threat than ever before, and he and his church led legal teams to put restrictions on the Green River ferryboat operations, which only further hurt the livelihood of the mountain men. Bridger was also accused of supplying the Ute tribe with weapons and supplies, and as such, Young assembled a posse to head to Fort Bridger and capture Jim. This posse was also the result of rumors that Bridger may have been spying on the Mormons on behalf of the U.S. government. In an attempt to protect his home, Bridger traveled to Washington, D.C. and spoke with the nation's leaders about the artificial lawsuits that were brought up against him, but this effort ultimately did nothing to solve the problem. Jim would lose Fort Bridger, and his remaining tie to the western frontier appeared to be that of a scout or a hunting party guide. He would serve in these roles intermittently, ultimately working closely with the U.S. government on multiple fronts. Bridger's life was further complicated when territory disputes between the U.S. government and the Mormons continued to grow, spurring on the Utah War, otherwise known as the Utah Expedition, the Utah Campaign, Buchanan's Blunder, the Mormon War, or the Mormon Rebellion. Sitting U.S. President James Buchanan appointed Alfred Cumming, a non-Mormon, to become the new governor of Utah. Cumming was to be escorted to Utah by 2,500 armed soldiers to relinquish Brigham Young of his duties. Bridger was hired as chief scout for the party of soldiers on July 16, 1857, which seemed to fulfill Young's accusation that Bridger was previously working with the U.S. government in opposition to the Mormons. One interesting tidbit is that on September 11, 1857, the Fancher and the Baker wagon trains from Arkansas were passing through mountain meadows in Utah when the Paiute and John Lee, a Mormon militiaman, attacked, killing 120 men and women, along with any child old enough to speak. Brigham Young denied involvement, claiming that he was not associated with the marauders and no evidence linked him to the event. Through yet another horrible winter, Bridger successfully led the soldiers through the mountains despite constant pestering by the members of the Latter-day Saints and their allies. The spring of 1858 brought about success as Young, burdened by the ever-growing military presence outside of the Great Salt Lake, saw his future dwindling. Brigham Young ultimately made the wise decision to step down, preventing further casualty on either side of the conflict. Governor Cumming entered the city on April 12th, in part thankful for the efforts of Jim Bridger and his guide service. After meeting with Solomon Hale, Captain William H. Hooper, and William Clayton, Bridger was described as follows, quote, "He spoke fluently and with great earnestness. One was readily impressed with the sincerity and honesty of the man. He was a man of character, embodying great courage and leadership. Very naturally, he he partook of the nature of his environment and life on the frontier, but he impressed me very strongly as being honest and dependable and a leader among men. He came readily into the association of big men, and he was given, by men of prominence, courtesies and considerations that are usually not extended to men of ordinary rank and character. The short-lived Pony Express was an incredible development in the U.S. frontier. April 3, 1860, marked the beginning of the short-lived Pony Express, which ran from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. Under full operating capacity, the Pony Express could cover the 2,000-mile stretch from Missouri to California in just over 10 days. This cut the mail delivery time of 24 days under ideal conditions, more than half. The Pony Express was run by riders on horseback, running at an average speed of 10 miles an hour. The horses would be swapped out at stations every 10 to 15 miles, and the riders would swap out every 75 to 100 miles. While this required both an exorbitant amount of man and horsepower, the system would be unsurpassed for the grand duration of 18 months. Jim Bridger had a hand in most every new work in the West, including the Pony Express. This mail route, along with the overland stagecoach and the Union Pacific Railroad, would follow Bridger's Pass, discovered by Bridger and his counterparts during the Stansbury expedition in 1850, as earlier mentioned. This pass shaved off approximately 60 miles from the Oregon Trail. Jim Bridger and his expertise had once again benefited the American people in a way they would never understand. Denver's newspaper, the Rocky Mountain Herald, reported that Jim Bridger had passed away earlier in 1860. However, they had to correct this misprint on December 12, 1860, as Bridger was alive and well. You guys thought you got out easy from this story, hey? There's still more to come. Captain Reynolds, who Bridger had guided out west on the search for Yellowstone, contacted Bridger on March 28, 1861, with the intent of having Jim guide him back out towards Yellowstone to map the areas they had not reached in their prior expedition. Reynolds was a member of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, and he was intent on drafting maps depicting the western frontier, including all of the internal maps that Jim Bridger had kept throughout the years. Much to Reynolds' dismay, the American Civil War began at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, with Confederate troops firing on the fort. Reynolds was swept up in the conflict, and he would not get back to travel with Jim Bridger. He would, later on, publish his reports and his maps, but he would never again work with Bridger. As more immigrants headed out west to California and Oregon, the desire to have faster communication was beginning to strike the American people. The Pony Express, taking 10 days, cut down the time for more than 3 weeks, and it was still not sufficient to appease the masses. Between July and October of 1861, Edward Crichton and the Western Union would string up telegraph wires across the expanse of the plains and the mountain passes, enabling near-instant communication between the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. This newfangled method of conversation put the Pony Express out of business just as quickly as it had gained traction. As we discussed earlier, the Horse Creek Treaty granted particular regions and lands to tribes depending on the agreed-upon allotment of land. As is typical now in hindsight, the U.S. ignored these treaty arrangements and the telegraph wires crossed lands designated to the native tribes. Disputes between the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes would lead to telegraph wires being yanked down by the warriors throwing ropes over the lines and pulling them down. This removed the white man's voice, as it was said. Relations between the native tribes and the Americans continued to falter, and Bridger and his counterparts saw this all too well. Skirmishes took place between telegraph operating stations and the tribes, as well as immigrant wagon trains and the tribes themselves. Bridger was tasked with guiding Colonel William Collins in May of 1862 as he set out to establish military outposts every 25 to 50 miles along the telegraph route. The hope was that by increasing U.S. military presence, the tribes would lessen their attacks. Later on that year, Bridger would be hired to aid in helping the Overland Mail Company and abandoning the North Platte Sweetwater portion of the route and relocating to Bridger Pass to avoid continual confrontation with the Plains tribes. Advanced immigration and newly discovered gold led to the forming of the Bozeman and Bridger Trails as they led into present-day Montana. 1864 marked an important milestone on the frontier. Just like the 49ers who headed out to California for the gold rush, men began to flock to Grasshopper Gulch and Alder Gulch, causing immense growth. These locations would become Bannock City and Virginia City, as that malleable, precious yellow ore called gold was found. By the spring of 1864, more than 20,000 people flocked to the mines operating in present-day Montana. In order to cut time off of their travels, these miners initially traveled down the Oregon Trail to Salt Lake City before heading out north to Montana. John Bozeman, however, saw this as a hindrance, and he cut off miles and miles of the trail by carving a new path called the Bozeman Trail. This new trail skirted the eastern slope of the Bighorn Mountains, heading northwest out of Fort Laramie. His route allowed for quick access to the mines, which would benefit a war-torn nation post-Civil War immensely by increasing economic growth and decreasing national debt. This faster route, however, was also risky, as the trail ran through Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands along the Powder River. As it turns out, these tribes never allied with the U.S. government through the signing of a treaty, and they considered this encroachment an active threat to their livelihood. Jim Bridger and Colonel Collins both worried about the use of the Bozeman Trail, and they considered the possibility of all-out war should this route continue to be utilized. Bridger rallied for the travelers to use the Bridger Trail, a new route that skirted the west side of the Bighorns, traveling through Friendly Crow and Shoshone lands, avoiding hostile territory. As time passed, Bridger and Collins were proven right in their statements and their predictions that the Bozeman Trail would lead to heightened conflicts with the Sioux and the Northern Cheyenne. Jim Bridger personally escorted several wagon trains up and down the Bridger Trail, scouting for hostile Indians and serving the travelers, before returning to Laramie in August. It was here that he was thrown from a mule, sustaining an injury that would, in some ways, remain with him through the remainder of his life. It must have been a humbling wake-up call to realize that he may not have been the once young and spry mountain man that he once was, capable of recovering from 2 arrow wounds in the wilderness. But Bridger would not slow down. As always, it's time for another war. The Powder River Expedition of 1865, or Powder River War, was a U.S. military operation intent on calming the unrest between the U.S. and the Lakota, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes. Bridger and his accompanying guides would play a key role in this campaign, as Captain Reynolds had not yet finished his western maps, and what information was available was not detailed enough for an active military engagement. Bridger would be hired at $10 per day to scout the region and lead the soldiers in fights against the Plains tribes. During this time, Bridger worked alongside General Connor and aided in selecting the site of Fort Connor, from which local missions could be run. After multiple engagements, some successful but most neutral at best, if not altogether unsuccessful, General Connor returned to Fort Laramie on September 29th. He was viewed with disgrace, as he was thought to have not punished the Plains tribes effectively. He was known to have issued inhumane orders, and he had lost more than 1,000 horses in a severe storm. Connor was reassigned to the District of Utah on August 22, 1865, and Bridger ended up at Fort Laramie just in time to face an early and brutal winter. Continued aggravation of the Plains tribes would continue well into 1866, with Congressman James Ashley of Ohio selecting a route to the Virginia City mines. Colonel Henry Maynadier asked Jim Bridger to help prepare a response to send both Ashley and the Secretary of War for the United States. Bridger settled on his namesake trail to the west of the Bighorns, but Maynadier seemingly paid this opinion no mind, stating that the Bozeman Trail east of the mountains was the most direct route. He stated that many wagons had passed over this trail with no incident. This statement resulted in the Army selecting to travel the Bozeman Trail through hostile lands that had already been proven to be fought over by the Plains tribes. What's a nation to do under such tension? Build more forts, of course. Maynadier recommended that in addition to Fort Connor, 2 additional forts be built along the Bozeman Trail, one on the Yellowstone River at Clark's Fork and a second built on the Bighorn River. These forts were located in Crow territory rather than hostile territory, and it's likely that Bridger provided input to help mitigate conflict as much as possible. Although many governmental and military leaders don't necessarily respect Jim Bridger's input at this point in time, he would soon be called back into U.S. military service. General Grenville Dodge, on behalf of the U.S. Army, once again called Bridger into service after he had spent some time off back home. General Dodge and Colonel Carrington put Bridger to work as the primary guide for the newly formed U.S. Army's Mountain District. Simultaneously, the U.S. Department of Indian Affairs was entertaining discussions to negotiate a treaty which directly contradicted the U.S. War Department's plan of taking hostile lands by force. It would seem that, contrary to the name of our country, this point in history was punctuated by a lack of understanding and unity among the U.S. government officials. Red Cloud, an Oglala Lakota chief among the 19 chiefs invited to represent 21 bands of the Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho, arrived at Fort Laramie on June 6, 1866. By June 8th, many of these leaders had left in anger as the U.S. had intentions of crossing the lands regardless of the circumstances. Red Cloud vowed to never let this take place. The remaining tribes who did not leave in frustration continued to negotiate. However, much like the treaty at Horse Creek, it's possible that there was diminishing faith in the word of the white man. Contrary to the opinion expressed by many of the natives, as well as by Bridger and his fellow guides in the Department of Indian Affairs, the U.S. War Department turned upon deaf ears and chose to utilize the Bozeman Trail rather than the Bridger Trail. General Dodge received word that Red Cloud would not forfeit lands above the North Platte, and that if a road was built, he would line it with dead soldiers. Red Cloud led the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors for 9 days in warfare against the immigrants and soldiers. During these 9 days, soldiers, immigrants, and wagon trains were all attacked and horses and livestock were stolen in abundance. Red Cloud and his men were going to succeed or die in battle, and through the remainder of July, they continued to fight. It was December when the U.S. Army realized the grand nature of their plight. In an attack against U.S. forces, Red Cloud, among many other leaders, led his warriors in a battle called 100 in the Hands on December 21, 1866. William Fetterman was confident that with a few dozen men he could withstand and turn the tide against the native warriors, but this confidence would soon be destroyed. A wood train returning to Fort Phil Kearny, located in northeastern Wyoming along the Bozeman Trail, came under attack from a small band of native warriors. Fetterman gathered 80 men, and he was instructed by General Carrington not to cross over the Lodge Trail Ridge just beyond a hill adjacent to the fort. Fetterman rode out and found a group of less than a dozen warriors led by the great Oglala leader, Crazy Horse, and he pursued the men to the top of Lodge Trail Ridge. The native warriors paused just out of range of their pursuers, and through various means harassed Fetterman and his men. There's a legend that Crazy Horse removed his breechcloth and went so far as to moon Fetterman. Persuaded by pride and anger, Fetterman ordered his men across the ridge to kill the offending natives, ultimately causing the demise of many, many men. More than 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors descended on the soldiers in a well-orchestrated trap. Interestingly enough, the warriors decided to try to strike based on the divinations of a medicine man who described the fall of 100 white soldiers, or Wasichus, and certain victory. The entirety of Fetterman's men were wiped out within 20 minutes in a battle that would forever be compared to the Alamo. Over the years, blame for the defeat would be laid on Carrington and Fetterman among many others, but the results of that battle and the continued loss of life during the war were a direct result of a series of terrible decisions made by multiple people. Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and the fighting tribes would prompt the U.S. Army into forming a treaty known as the Fort Laramie Treaty in 1868. Red Cloud and his fellow warriors were the only Indians to win a war against the U.S. government in its 100-year history. Jim Bridger tried many times to convey the importance of staying out of the areas east of the Bighorns. He went so far as to lay out Bridger Trail, and he spent much of his time guiding U.S. troops and immigrants up and down this trail. Bridger and the Department of Indian Affairs lost the battle with the U.S. War Department, and it cost many lives. With his ever-increasing age, Bridger would soon see a shift on the frontier. That shift would come primarily from U.S. government leaders and Army officials. After the Battle of 100 in the Hand, Fort C.F. Smith was alleged to be the next target of opportunity for the Indian warriors. It was rumored that 11 bands of Indians had united to take part in the attack, but the Crow Indians, knowing that Jim Bridger was located in the fort, would not allow Bridger to be put in danger, and as such, the attack expedition was thwarted. On June 11th, much-needed reinforcements and supplies arrived at Fort C.F. Smith, being sent from Fort Laramie. Bridger, as always, served as a guide leading the soldiers to Fort Phil Kearny, the site of Fetterman's Folly. On his way to the fort, and always eager to explore, he once again shortened the trail by marking another cutoff which provided better access for light wagon trains and cavalry. Through the course of Bridger's life and his work detail as a frontier guide, he would see major shifts in many areas. The most obvious transformation was the changing landscape and socio-economic and political implication of mass Western immigration. As he aged, wildlands became home to full-scale forts and military outposts. One change in particular that is hard to quantify is the shifting attitude of the traveling immigrants and the U.S. Army and government officials. As Bridger aged, more and more young officers hoping to prove themselves headed out west, and with every passing year and every new face, it seemed that Bridger and his fellow frontier guides lost more and more respect. It was only those officers long tested on the frontier who understood and welcomed the input of aging mountain men, those whose extensive knowledge base included Indian warfare tactics, survival skills, travel routes, and much more. Arriving at Fort Phil Kearny, Bridger would learn that unlike his previous commanders, Colonel John Smith, the newly instated commander of the U.S. Army's Mountain District, did not want him there. He viewed the input of an aging frontiersman as a burden rather than a gift, and Smith went so far as to state that, quote, "He is not needed here, and one guide for this post is enough." Additionally, Smith stated that he did not view the rumors of an upcoming fight with serious concerns, as he had 20 mounted scouts operating for him. Those scouts must have lacked frontier knowledge, as the Sioux raided areas around Fort Phil Kearny on July 12th, 17th, and 19th, and on August 2nd, the Sioux, numbering more than 1,000 men strong, attacked woodcutters near the fort. At the same time, Cheyennes attacked workers at Fort C.F. Smith. With Bridger now absent from Fort Smith, it's likely that the tribes felt a surge of boldness. Jim Bridger received a temporary discharge in September 1867 as a means to aid in recuperating from his physical ailments resulting from a life spent on the frontier. He would return later to Fort Laramie after a brief respite. Meanwhile, after the completion of the Union Pacific Railroad, the U.S. no longer needed access to the Bozeman Trail, the cause for many horrific battles. Red Cloud sent word that he would halt the attacks on the U.S. soldiers and civilians, provided that Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith were abandoned. In May of 1868, the U.S. agreed, giving its word that it would no longer occupy the Powder River country. As mentioned earlier, this resulted in Red Cloud and his men winning the war against the U.S. government, albeit for a temporary time. Sadly, the Crows, who remained friendly to the U.S., had their territory reduced from 38 million acres to 8 million acres in the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Once again, we see the lack of respect held for the native tribes regardless of their political and moral affiliation. As is the case in all stories, everything must come to an end. Jim Bridger's final years were interesting. He was provided a few more opportunities to head out west, but nothing would ever be as it was when he was a young free trapper. Bridger's final frontier expeditions, including guiding 3 companies from Fort Fetterman to Medicine Bow and the building of a road in May of 1868. Bridger was also hired from May 23rd to July 21st to guide General Henry A. Morrow and a posse of 200 wagons in closing down the forts along the Bozeman Trail. May 23rd may not mean much by itself, but on that day in 1868, Kit Carson, one of America's greatest military scouts, passed away in his home. In a roundabout way, it's fitting that the great guides and frontiersmen were coming to an end, all with one another. In part, due to his failing eyesight and his age, Jim Bridger was discharged from his U.S. Army duties for the last time on July 21, 1868. Bridger tried to avoid retirement as his heart belonged to the West. He took it upon himself to travel to Fort Hays, Kansas to speak with General Philip Sheridan concerning a winter campaign against the Indians south of the Arkansas River. With decades of experience on the frontier, Bridger advised that this campaign be halted as the weather on the plains would do more damage to the soldiers than the fighting itself. Once again, Bridger proved accurate in his assessment as a huge blizzard struck the men. Regardless, Bridger's knowledge was no longer desired by the new generation of Army leaders. In February of 1869, Bridger attempted to work with a longtime friend named Robert Campbell to become the Indian agent for the Crow tribe. This appointment would seem to be a no-brainer, with Jim having longtime affiliations with the Crow. Campbell ultimately approached General Sherman, who vouched for Bridger in this matter and approved his nomination, sending it to the Secretary of the Interior. Sadly, news came back that, quote, the Indian Commission deemed it imprudent to recommend anyone for office in the Indian Department. There will be no agent appointed except Quakers or Army officers. So much for coming out of retirement. Jim Bridger had seen his last days out west, and his time was nearing an end. Bridger lost his eyesight by the late 1870s. In his remaining years, Bridger would tend to his prized apple orchards and spend his days riding his horse around the farm, most likely recalling his youthful days and the times he spent roaring across the prairie and the mountain valleys on horseback. He would sometimes sit down in his fields of wheat and grain, feeling the height of the growing vegetation, probably recalling the endless fields of prairie grass and sagebrush swaying in the wind. It's said that in his final days, Bridger would sit on his veranda, leaning on his cane, facing west. Despite his lost eyesight, he would say, "I wish I was back there, among the mountains again. You can see so much farther in that country." Jim Bridger passed away on July 17, 1881, leaving behind 3 surviving children and a legacy far greater than any other man in American history. He discovered the Great Salt Lake. He ran the Bad Pass Rapids. He led the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, and he worked alongside Kit Carson, Jedediah Smith, Hugh Glass, Osborne Russell, John C. Fremont, and others. He mapped the West for the U.S. Army and the U.S. government. He aided in unifying Native tribes in the U.S. government, taking part in the Horse Creek Treaty. He built Fort Bridger and assisted the government in the Utah War. He discovered Bridger Pass, and he averted further death by laying out the Bridger Trail to counteract the war-torn Bozeman Trail. Bridger lived among the natives, and his own family included wives from the Flathead, the Ute, and the Shoshone tribes. He spoke the language of the American people, the French, the Spanish, and the natives. He was an interpreter, a scout, a leader, and a man among men. Never again will we see the likes of Jim Bridger. With our story now over, there isn't much more to say. Thank you for your time and your support of our show. All of the sources used to develop this special series on Jim Bridger are listed below in the show description. And I would like to ask you, as a personal favor, to consider sharing this show with somebody in your family or your friend group. Our goal is to provide family-friendly content to share our love of the outdoors and to do so with a Christian focus. I have a hard time sharing the gospel, and I feel that this outlet will allow me to do so in an effective way. I ask that you help me to share Christ through this podcast. I have links to my social media below as well. Check out Mildew Twang Outdoors and TJ Leatherworks on Instagram and Facebook to see some pretty intriguing projects. And thank you for your continued support. Love in Christ.